Good evening. My name is Andrew Grantham. I hope you're having a blessed Sunday. And I'm going to talk a little bit about federalism and some of the rights that are protected by our government. So first, I understand federalism to be another form of check and balances that the founders put in place, namely that the federal government and the sovereign state governments would be able to balance each other's power out with different decisions. Now, a lot of federalism was predicated on the idea that there would be a limited federal government, that the scope of things the federal government could act on would be very finite, and everything else would be left to the people and the states, as per some later Bill of Rights amendments, namely the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. But over time, as we've seen federalism evolve, we've seen the federal government's preeminence continue to rise. One example of how this happens is through commerce. Really, there's nothing that's not interstate commerce these days, let alone international commerce. And so Congress, through the Commerce Clause, and even when they enforce the Dormant Commerce Clause, are able to control and regulate a large scope of state activity. So this is maybe an area of encroachment into state sovereignty that the founders would not have anticipated. And it's hard for me to say whether they would have approved it or not, because it does seem to follow the rules that they've given the federal government. They did want to have a strong central government. But to some extent, the states aren't really able to enforce their own sovereignty and be a check like they used to be. Montesquieu, who's a very influential philosopher that many of the founders studied his work, was paraphrased by Brutus, someone using a pseudonym to discuss the concept that republican governments needed to be small in scale, because when you had too many constituents for too few representatives, there wouldn't be able to be good governance. And so we look at our federal congressmen right now, who each one represents over 600,000 individual constituents. That's a pretty large span of control. They're not really going to be able to meet individual needs, but general needs, and that was a concern that some of the early founders had. States, on the other hand, they have much smaller, they have more representatives per their population, and so there's a better opportunity for adequate representation. But again, the states rely almost entirely on the federal government for many of the regulations that are happening now. Now, one misconception I had about federalism was the role that state constitutions played in protecting rights. I didn't realize that many of the states had declarations of rights that even predate the Declaration of Independence, like Virginia's does, and more so go on to protect some rights even more than the Bill of Rights does. An example of this would be Pennsylvania, that protects our rights against unwarranted searches and seizures even more by extending the right to privacy, saying that people should be secure in their persons and property. And so the dichotomy of this is seeing the rulings of U.S. v. Leon, which was a federal Supreme Court case that, because the Fourth Amendment only protects against unwarranted seizures, created grounds for the good faith clause. Whereas in Pennsylvania, in Commonwealth v. Edmunds, that same application was not applied to the state's criminal laws, because Article 1, Section 8 of the Pennsylvania Constitution expressly gave protections to privacy. So there is no good faith clause for Pennsylvanian criminal cases that are specific state violations of state statute. I think it's pretty interesting. And there are many more examples too. I don't have time to get into. Now, I was asked what are the three rights that I value, and the three I value more than others are probably equality, the freedom to practice religion, and also due process. Now, equality is not an explicit right in the Bill of Rights. It was something that the founders put into the Declaration of Independence, where they said that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So, in that construct, we later see what becomes the genesis for the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. So over time, we've seen the protection against discrimination and also equality increase both in its the protection but also in visibility, which is especially true today. I don't think the founders could have possibly anticipated that the Supreme Court would be making a ruling on the permissibility of two homosexual people getting married. That probably would have been pretty foreign compared to the morality of their age. Now, when you look at due process, that's something that seems consistent over time. Due process has always been protected. We've seen some things go one way or the other. The good faith exception kind of was a win for law enforcement in being able to not necessarily deny due process, but to not lose cases because of some errors. But then you look at Miranda, which extended a great amount of due process when people had to have their rights read to them. But recently there has been some encroachment on due process, namely the Patriot Act, post-September 11th, that made it much easier and streamlined for law enforcement to get wiretaps and warrants when there was some even suspected terrorism nexus. Not even probable cause, just a suspected terrorism nexus. And then you look at the treatment of the detainees in Gitmo, who are not being treated as U.S. citizens and extended due process, nor being treated as prisoners of war, but they're detainees who have had their habeas corpus suspended. And I don't think many of the founders who believed in natural law theory would have agreed with these decisions, who thought that rights should be extended to all people, even foreign citizens. And lastly, when it comes to the freedom of religion, I do think that it's still being protected. I don't think it's as visible as it used to be at the time of the founders. When you look at back in the late 1700s, many of the constitutions had specific language that acknowledged a creator, that thanked God for the ability to create a governance like this and wanted to lift up these governments for God's glory. And that seems very much in line with 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, where Paul says that whatever you do, do for the glory of God. That was definitely the founders' intent in creating a government that protected religion so that the state would not select one denomination and coerce the rest of the population into following it. They also believe Romans 13:1 more than likely from a lot of their correspondence, which said that God appoints the leaders of nations, and so they did feel called by God to lead in that way. So faith was a very important and visible part of the way that they led the government. And that was pointed out in Lee versus Weissman by the dissenting opinion, Justice Scalia's dissent, where he said that many of the initial inauguration addresses specifically thanked God for their being able to be the leaders of this country. But we see that in recent terms it's become much more taboo to do that. You don't see Congress or the President thanking God for our ability to pass this legislation. It's become more of a cliche phrase to say God bless America at the end of the speech. And in other cases, it's not as acceptable or welcome to be able to openly profess your faith in public. So I would say that while religion's still protected, it's definitely not as visible as it was at the time of the founders. So thank you for your time. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and I hope you have a great and wonderful week.